All right, welcome everyone for the last of the 2025 Spring Garden Series. Appreciate everyone being here tonight. I know I'm a little blustery today, but definitely a nice improvement of having that spring weather. It's definitely on the horizon. So I got to do some gardening yesterday, and it was very, very fulfilling, even though it was a little windy, but not bad. So tonight we are talking about insects and diseases. And so I call this presentation "Quit Bugging Me" because that's what it feels like, right? You put the plants out and you're like, leave me alone. So that is what we will be talking about this evening. And so um, if you are joining us for the first time, my name is Courtney and I am the horticulture educator in Cleveland County. And I'm glad that you are here. We've been having a good time with these garden series, and we'll get started. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. I hate to sound like a broken record if you've been here before, but just want to remind everyone, please keep your microphone muted. Got a few people on here, so just kind of helps us have a better experience if we don't hear phones going off or dogs or things like that. If you have questions, please do place those in the chat. I have that up in the corner of my screen, and so I'm watching that and giving it a glance every once in a while, and we'll pause periodically to ask for questions. We are recording this evening, so keep that in mind. And if you haven't already, do please fill out the pre-assessment. Sent that out in an email earlier today, but I also just threw it in the chat. If we have time later, one of the questions is asking about specific insects or diseases, so specific pests. We're not really going to focus on that so much tonight, but if we have time, we can pull up that pre-assessment and go over some of the particular specific buggers, if you will, that you have questions about. And then just a reminder, I am in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. So if you are joining us from another part of the country and they have a specific insect or diseases that we may not have in Oklahoma, I may not have experience with those. But if you have questions about them, let me know. I'm sure we can get those answered for you. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So I mentioned tonight we are talking about the control specifically of the pests that we have in our garden. And so a couple definitions if you're unfamiliar. Entomology, that's going to reference the study of insects. And so this is, you can even go to school at Oklahoma State University and other agricultural universities and get degrees in entomology if you want. And so there's a very diverse, wonderful world of insects out there. And so there's an entire discipline devoted to learning about those insects, as well as plant pathology, and that is the study of plant diseases. And so any organism, well, I should say non-animal organism that is attacking our plants. And so that references the study of plant diseases, how we manage them, how we can mitigate them, and all the things that go along with that. And so when we're talking about insect control, we tend to talk in the world of entomology. And when we talk about plant diseases, we're talking about the world of plant pathology. So those are just a couple definitions to keep in mind throughout the presentation. So a couple things when talking about pest management, we have a couple keys. And so these are very important things to think about as you're beginning to take an assessment of what's going on in your garden or your landscape and understanding really how to approach the situation. And so our first key to success and key to pest management is knowing your landscape. And so knowing what's already there, knowing what pests are associated with certain plants, and knowing what to expect when you're gardening and managing your landscape. And so just kind of being proactive and having an inventory and being in a way expecting the worst, but hoping for the best. And so knowing your landscape can be a very important first step. It's also important to know your adversary. So know what disease or insect you're up against and fully understand it in a way that maybe if you understand its life cycle, or the way that it spreads, those can be different ways to slow down and really understand what it is that what you're up against. And then also knowing the tools that you have in your toolbox. And so that's a lot of what we're talking about tonight is what do I have available to be able to control that pest or to prevent that pest from even getting into the garden in the first place. So those are some things to think about. So to go into these a little bit more in-depthly around knowing your landscape. So some pests are very maybe attracted to certain plants. And so they have almost a, if you build it, they will come mentality with these particular plants. And so an example of that in the picture on the top right is Euonymus. And that insect, those little white small speckles all over that plant, that insect there is Euonymus scale. And so Euonymus scale tends to really be very attracted to the Euonymus. And so if you're going to plant Euonymus, you may need to think about, okay, well, I know that this pest is out there. I know it's going to be a potential, and take some measures to be able to control that. Now, some other plants that you may have in the landscape, they may have a close association with insects or other diseases, but they may not necessarily have, or I should say that insect in particular may not be detrimental to the health of that plant. And so you may see an insect, this is particularly in the case of insects, but you may see an insect around and think like, oh my gosh, this is an infestation. What's going on? This is crazy. But they're more there maybe for something else. And so the example I have in the bottom right, that picture there is the box elder bug, which tends to go after the box elder. And so with the box elder bug, that box elder bug is not really necessarily detrimental to the plant. It's not damaging its health. It's there actually eating the seeds of the tree, but they come in large numbers. And so it seems like it's this massive infestation, and they're maybe can be sometimes daunting when you see a massive insects, but they're not really there doing any damage. And so knowing if you plant one of these plants that has one of these insects, you then know, okay, well, that's not necessarily going to be something I have to worry about controlling, have to worry about even taking measures. And even though it may be unsightly or concerning to see a mass of insects, it's not something we really have to worry about. And then also too, having the location of your materials or your landscape or plants within your landscape can also affect potential pest problems. And so let's say you really want a box elder. It may not be a wise thing to have a box elder very up close against the house, because then these little critters can get into the home and become a nuisance to us in our home. And so knowing where you're putting things within the landscape and how they relate to either the home or to other plants, those can all be things to consider as well. Something about this in particular, so think about where you're putting your compost bin. If you're composting, a compost bin tends to attract some critters, and having that very close to the home can then encourage or maybe put these critters in close proximity to the home and cause some challenges there. So the location of the materials in the landscape should be considered as well. And then it's also important to know your adversary. And so when you're looking at a disease or a potential insect, proper identification is going to be the very first key for that effective control. Because if you don't really know what you're up against, you may not know all the tools that you have in your toolbox. And so in that picture, on the picture in the bottom there, we have three different stink bugs. On the bottom left, this is the spine-shouldered stink bug, and he is a pest, and so he tends to eat our plants and is not a very good insect that we want to have within our landscape. Whereas this stink bug here, the green stink bug, can actually be a beneficial insect and sometimes tends to go after some of our caterpillar pests. and can be a good one that we want to keep in the landscape. And then this one over here on the right, that is the spine shoulder. Or not, sorry, I just said that. Spine shoulder. That's the brown marmorated stink bug, which is another negative or not so great pest to have in our garden. In fact, they can be very invasive, and they haven't been found in very many places in Oklahoma, but they are a pest in all of the states around us and can be an issue. And so with this, it's very important to be able to recognize how our plant is responding to that pest's presence. And so whether or not that's an insect feeding or a disease spreading, just be aware of that. And we can maybe, if we can't find the actual culprit there, be able to think about the symptoms and the signs that that pest has left so that we can begin the diagnostic process when looking at those insects or diseases. And then it's also important to know when, how, or if control is necessary. And so sometimes it's very easy to take control measures when that insect population is very small or when that disease has just started. And then knowing what the tools, of course, this is the next one, but the tools that we have in our toolbox that we're able to control. And then sometimes, if we just have a couple of insects or maybe just a little bit of disease kind of floating around, control may not necessarily be necessary in that situation. And so just think about all those things, understanding, okay, well, if I have one or two spider mites, that may not be that big of a deal. But if I have one or two tomato hornworms, that can be a big deal. So recognizing when control is necessary. And so I want to introduce this concept of integrated pest management. And so the kind of hairy definition here on the screen is a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that maximizes economic, health, and environmental risk. So it's kind of a long definition, but it's basically saying we have a lot of opportunities, or I should say a lot of tools in our toolbox to be able to control these pests that we may be coming in contact with in the garden. And based on the situation, we can approach that in a way that doesn't cost us very much, doesn't have a very, any maybe less detrimental effects on our environment, or maybe less pesticides. And so it's just this kind of idea of getting away from just spraying routinely and continuously to get rid of certain insects or diseases, I should say. And that's not just saying that we're not using chemicals. It's saying that it's a tool within our toolbox, but we have all of these other tools. And so we'll talk about that towards the end. And I mentioned in the pre-assessment, how familiar are you with IPM? And I intentionally didn't give the full acronym of Integrated Pest Management because a lot of times we refer to this as IPM, and we're talking about this holistic approach to treating pests within the landscape or within the garden. And so to visualize this a little bit, if you kind of want to think about it as a pyramid, the very first step is prevention. And so if we can prevent the insects from getting into the garden in the first place, then it makes it a whole lot easier for us along down the road. But then there are other things like cultural controls or sanitation. So cleaning up the garden, pruning when we see diseases beginning to take over the plant. Those can all be options. Choosing resistant varieties, that is also another cultural control. We can also rely on physical or mechanical controls. This is simply removing in those insects. And so when it comes to, say, that tomato hornworm, if you have one or two, it's pretty easy to squish those or get rid of them in some manner. Biological is using natural pests or natural predators, I should say, of that pest to help do the control for you. And so you're almost using the ecosystem to your benefit to control some of those pests that you may be encountering. And then the last option we have is our chemical controls. And so that can either be an organic control, and so there are organic pesticides available, or using a synthetic chemical control. And so those are all tools within the toolbox, and depending on what it is that we are looking at within the garden or the landscape, may help us decide what it is that we want to do. So thinking about those keys, thinking about the situation, we can decide what is the best or most effective way to control that particular pest. So when we're looking at a pest, it's important to be able to kind of assess the crime scene, if you will. And so a lot of times we're not going to come in and see the actual culprit as we come into that situation. And so looking at the situation, or the crime scene, I should say, we have signs and we have symptoms. And signs are evidence of the actual pest. And so that's something left behind by that particular culprit. Whereas symptoms are the plant's response. And so the plant has responded to the presence of that pest. So to be a little bit more specific and give some examples, a sign of an insect, that can include waste product. So maybe cast skins or honeydew, which is this kind of sugary substance left behind from feeding, or frass, which is a fancy word for insect poop. Those are all signs that an insect has been there. As well as webbing, that's a particular sign, can be a sign of spider mites. And so those are all evidence that the insect was actually there. Whereas symptoms, the plant's response, that can include discoloration or distortion of leaves, blossoms or twigs, chewing damage, cracked bark, dieback of plant parts. And so the symptoms are really evidence that the insect has been there feeding. And we have some examples of that coming up. And then disease examples for signs and symptoms. It's a little harder to look for signs of diseases because diseases caused by fungi, bacteria, viruses, those are very small organisms. And so we can't really see them too well with our natural eyesight, but there are a few. And so ooze is a sign of a disease. That's when, for example, if you have maybe a tree and there's a wound in the tree and you actually see like a liquid oozing from the plant, there's actually bacteria and different organisms within that, and you're actually seeing the sign of that disease. Rust is another example. So that's actually a sign of the fungus growing on top of the leaf. It has a very red, rusty appearance to it, as well as mildew, which is a sign of a fungi growing on top of that leaf, and appears almost like someone spilled flour on the leaves, if you will. So symptoms are a bit more, we're going to see a lot more symptoms with diseases. And so that can include spots, wilt, rot, mosaic or mottling. That's a pretty common one for viruses. And then chlorosis, that's a fancy word for plant yellowing, and necrosis, which is a fancy word for plant death. And so these are all symptoms, the plant responding to the presence of diseases. So what's going on? What's going on with my plant? So we'll talk about diseases first. And diseases are fascinating. And so this picture here on the right is and sorry, I'm moving my chat over so I can explain this better. So this is a plant cell. And if you think about how very, very small a plant cell is, these are how much smaller some of the plant diseases that we're dealing with are compared to a plant cell. And so a fungi, this is kind of an image of a fungi entering that plant cell and being able to suck up the nutrients and carbohydrates that would exist within this cell. This is the head of a nematode. And so nematodes are technically are animals, but they're a very small living organism. And so we classify them as a disease. And then over here we have bacteria, so even smaller within the plant cell, and very, very small, we have the viruses. And so those are really just very, very small, microscopic, need a special microscope to be able to look at those. And so that's in relation to a plant cell, which is already pretty small. And so those are kind of examples of those diseases that we may encounter, or the types of organisms of diseases that we would encounter. But that doesn't necessarily include environmental. And so diseases can be either biotic, and so those are those first four caused by a living organism, or they can be abiotic, and that's the plant's response then to an unfavorable environment. And so some of the things I noted in the pre-assessment, so in particular like fruit rot or blossom end rot of tomato, that's actually not necessarily a disease. That's not caused by a living organism. It's actually an environmental response to increased transpiration or increased water movement within the plant. As well as sometimes leaf curling. Leaf curling can be a response to high temperatures, especially in the tomato, which I think was the example, or the one mentioned in the pre-assessment. And so these are all those are all abiotic issues, the plant's responding to an unfavorable environment. And so we include that in the discussion of plant pathology as well. So to go into these a little bit deeper, fungi, these are going to be our most common diseases that we're facing. They're very common. And they're pretty interesting because they spread by spores, and those spores can land on the plant, and then they spread by mycelium. And so that's this kind of spider web look down here, where we're seeing that fungi begin to spread and take over. And from that, they're able to actually enter plant cells, and that's where they absorb those nutrients and those carbohydrates. Fungi really like moisture. And so you tend to see a lot of fungal diseases when we have cool, or not necessarily even cool, but just wet periods within our landscape. And so if we have wet, humid, periods. A lot of times we see this in May and June. If we've got a lot of heavy rain, we're probably going to see a lot of fungi later in the season. And so a couple examples of things that you may encounter: apple rust or cedar apple rust, black spot of rose. If you're growing roses, I'm sure you've encountered this, as well as powdery mildew, which can be pretty common on our cucurbit vegetables. And then bacteria. Bacteria is another living organism that can cause disease. And they're very, very small, but uniquely, a lot of times in our foliar bacterial diseases, you're going to see this yellow halo around the necrotic spots on the leaves. And so that's very indicative of a bacterial disease. Something else you can consider too, we have some bacterial diseases, bacterial wilts of tomatoes. And so this is a tomato right here. But sometimes when you're dealing with the bacteria, you can even take a cutting of that plant and place it in water, and you'll begin to see these strings come out. And that's actually, you're beginning to see the bacteria come out of that plant, out of the vascular tissue. And so that can be one way to test whether or not if you have a bacterial disease in your plant. So a couple examples: bacterial wilt, fire blight is a very common one, especially on our fruit trees. You're going to see, you may see some fire blight. Crown gall as well, which forms these huge, almost tumor-like growths on our plants, and really prevent the vascular tissue from doing what it needs to do. And then viruses. Hate to say a plant disease is pretty, but if we were, that would be the viruses. So these are very, very small organisms, or I should say, but they're really particles. And then so small, we actually have to use a special type of microscope to be able to see whether or not they're present. But they create these very unique patterns. They actually can change like the cellular, or I should say the DNA of those individual cells. And so you start to see this modeling, or this mosaic, where you have different colors on the plant right next to each other. So that would be an example. I think that's cucumber mosaic virus. This is hostavirus X, where you're seeing those ring spots begin to form, creating a very characteristic type look on that plant. And the nematodes, which are actually, they're actually an animal, they're in the animal kingdom, but they're so small, we categorize them with the plant diseases. They can be soil dwelling, but they can also be foliar dwelling, or exist in the vascular tissue. And so essentially they're there feeding, and they're going to disrupt the plant processes by their feeding. And so sometimes, especially with the soil-borne nematodes, you may have a plant that you're growing and you're watering it, but it just keeps wilting. And if that's the case, you may want to bring in a sample to us, and we may want to investigate it for nematodes, because they're essentially, down here in this photo, causing disruption to the plant roots, pulling up that water as well as nutrients. And so those can be something to look for as well. I don't have on here a couple examples, but the root knot nematode, that's the photo we have there, as well as pine wilt disease. That is vectored by another insect, but essentially what happens is the nematodes clog up the vascular tissue, and so the plant can't move water and nutrients as needed within that plant, and it comes across overall as the plant wilting and eventually dying. So that's an example of nematodes as well. And then we have the environmental causes, which, if you are in Oklahoma with me, we have a lot of environmental causes of issues. And so these plant diseases can also be abiotic, meaning that they're not caused by a living organism. They're caused by some environmental stress. So a couple examples of that can be site disturbance. So like on a construction site, if you're looking at maybe putting in a pool or a new shed, and that's right next to a big, beautiful tree, that can potentially damage the tree. Temperature, of course, if we have long periods of high temperatures or shockingly low temperatures, which has happened recently in the past couple years, those can all be sources of abiotic diseases, as well as nutrient deficiencies or soil pH. Sometimes if the pH is too high, the plants aren't able to pull up the micronutrients that they need, and we get a chlorosis, an iron chlorosis, that can be solved by addressing the soil pH. But all these things mentioned here, chemical injuries, like tomatoes are very susceptible or prone to herbicide drift. Those can all be sources of abiotic issues. And a lot of times when we see weird things going on with plants, really the majority of the time is it may be something environmental causing the issue. So I was looking at a picture of some hollies today, and the foliage was beginning to deteriorate and had some black spots, but what I really think was going on was it maybe was a winter desiccation. So that would be to mean that it wasn't receiving enough water during the winter. So with our broadleaf evergreens like hollies or magnolias, that can be an issue because they're still more metabolically active in the wintertime than our deciduous trees. And so it looks like a disease, but it's very likely caused due to an environmental issue. And of course, we can be the problem sometimes too. This chainsaw blight here. So sometimes if we go in and we try to fix the problem, or we just do something that can cause its own issue as well. So unfortunately, chainsaw blight can be a very common abiotic pathogen after if we have an ice storm and a lot of people go out and want to prune their trees. Unfortunately, this type of pruning causes a lot of brand new growth that tends to be a lot weaker, and the trees, they don't really recover from this type of pruning. And so sometimes we can be the issue as well. So any questions about types of diseases before we move on to assessing insect damage? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to keep going on, but please, if you have any, throw them in the chat. So when we look at insect damage or the plant symptoms to the presence of insects, it's important to consider insect biology and the type of insect that we're dealing with, or in particular, the type of mouth part that they have. And so different insects have different mouth parts. And so I've got a couple examples down here, like a grasshopper has a chewing, and so that's almost similar to us, and they're actually taking bites of things, as opposed to maybe like a mosquito, which has a piercing, sucking mouth part, and can so essentially has a needle as a mouth part and can come in and suck the blood if it's a mosquito, or the plant juices if it's a plant feeding insect. The siphoning mouth part, so in the case of butterflies and moths, they have these straw-like mouth parts that they use to drink nectar from various flowers. Or the sponging mouth part, so like a housefly basically has a sponge as a mouth. And we won't get into too many details about how that works because it can be a little bit nasty. But when we're talking about the response of the plant to the presence of that insect, we're going to see damage, and we can usually narrow down what insect it is we have in our situation if we can determine what mouth part they have. And that's pretty easy to determine based on the symptoms of the plant. And so in particular, we're going to be most interested in the chewing and the piercing, sucking type insects. Those are really the ones that are out there feeding on plants in a detrimental manner. And so the sucking damage really almost looks like all these tiny little pinpricks on the plant. And that's because that's essentially what's going on, is that an insect is going in and sucking out the juices or the nutrients and the carbohydrates of these plants and damaging these individual plant cells. And so almost has what we call a stifling effect when you look at it very closely. So begs the question, who sucks? And so our scale insects, so crepe myrtle bark scale or euonymus scale, those are all insects that have piercing, sucking mouth parts. Aphids as well as spider mites, which spider mites are technically not an insect, they're an arachnid, but for the sake of tonight, we're going to group them together. And then the true bugs. And so you can tell a true bug because it has this triangle shape right here. And so that's called a scutellum. But that triangle shape right there indicates that that is part of the true bug order or kind of group of insects. And is going to have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So stink bugs, squash bugs, a lot of less than favorable critters in that group. But something that's associated with the piercing, sucking insects is honeydew, which honeydew is that sticky liquid excrement that can build up. So essentially I skipped a slide. So essentially they're sitting there and they're sucking the juices out of the plant, but they don't necessarily need everything. And so it's kind of a residue or an excrement left over after they're feeding. And so it's very sugary, and that heavy sugar, not only does it kind of build up a shiny appearance on the leaves, but it can also support the growth of a sooty mold, which is kind of a mold that will grow in honeydew. And so this picture here, that's crepe myrtle bark scale, which is a challenging pest for what used to be a very low maintenance plant in our landscapes. Pressing the thing. And so sometimes you'll even notice if you have a bad crepe myrtle bark scale infestation, you'll almost notice the sooty mold before you actually notice the scale there. So you may notice like the sooty mold beginning to grow, or not grow, but like fall onto your concrete or around the mulch around that plant. And that's what sometimes we tend to notice before we even notice that we have insects on our plants. Now I will mention, so thrips, they are another pest of plants. They have similar to piercing sucking, but slightly different. So they have what's called a rasping sucking mouth part. And so that essentially almost goes in and scrapes off the top of the plant cell, and then they suck that up. And so it almost looks like instead of piercing, it's like someone kind of scraped off the top. And so thrips, we don't necessarily always notice thrips in the landscape, but they can be a pretty detrimental pest within greenhouses, particularly on flowers. So if you start to notice discoloration on the flower, that can be a case of thrips. But thrips, while can cause some aesthetic damage, are also known to be detrimental because they can be vectors. And I thought that was my next slide, but I have a slide on this in a little bit. But vectors are essentially insects that they may not necessarily be doing the bulk of the damage, but they're carrying something, whether or not that's another disease or a virus or a nematode or something. They're carrying that and then bringing it from plant to plant to plant as they feed. So the feeding that they're doing themselves is not so much the issue, but it is that spread of the whatever that is they're vectoring can be a challenge. And thrips are notorious for this with a lot of different viruses. So we also have chewing damage, and chewing damage is pretty noticeable, especially when it gets to this stage when your leaves start to look like Swiss cheese, where we actually have bites taken out of our plant. So chewing can look a little bit different depending on the type of insect. We can have window painting where they're actually kind of chewing off the very top of those plant cells, or maybe skeletonizing where they're eating in between plant veins. Chewing can also occur internally. So in the case of borers, there's actually essentially a small caterpillar or larva, I should say larva, going around in that plant, serpentining and chewing and just messing up all the internal things inside that plant. But of course, a lot of times we tend to notice chewing damage as external damage when we start to see poles taken out of our plants. So who chews? We have the caterpillars. We have beetles, which the larval stage we can sometimes refer to as grubs if they're soil dwelling. Those can all be the youth or the young stage, or the larval stage, I should say, immature stage, that's the word I'm looking for. The immature stage of that beetle has chewing mouth parts as well as the adult stage. Whereas caterpillars, the immature stage and the larval stage have chewing mouth parts, but when they metamorphosize into their adult stage, that can be, I'm sorry, my neighbor's dog is barking and it's distracting. The adult stage have siphoning mouth parts, so we're more worried about that young larval stage. And grasshoppers, somebody mentioned grasshoppers in the pre-assessment, such a hard one to take care of and manage within the landscape, as well as sawflies, which are the immature larval stage of some different types of wasps, I believe. But some other damage that we can encounter when dealing with insects, we have the leaf miners, and so that's actually a very small insect in between layers of cell within that plant leaf, and so they're actually kind of eating out in between those plant cells within those layers. The root feeders, and so those are our grubs. They can also cause quite a bit of damage, as well as so insect galls. We can see those in our landscape, and that's not all the time a sign of a detrimental impact, but what it is an insect may come and feed or lay an egg, and the plant essentially responds by building this gall around that area. And so it's not so much damaging to that plant from a health perspective, but it can be unsightly, especially if these galls are falling on our sidewalks and on our driveway and making it difficult to clean up and walk around. We can also have damage from oviposition, ovipositor damage, and so that would be if an insect comes in and lays an egg in the plant. The wound created from laying an egg in that spot can sometimes create a wound. And okay, so I mentioned vectors, and so that's sometimes when an insect isn't necessarily doing damage from feeding, but by spreading some type of disease. And so essentially it feeds on a sick plant, moves to a healthy plant, feeds again, and spreads that disease to the healthy plant. And so a couple examples of this, pine wilt, which I mentioned, which is a nematode that then clogs the vascular tissue. Rose rosette, which is a very common issue that we encounter if you're trying to grow roses. That one is, that's a virus that is vectored by the Eriophyid mite. And so that one can be a challenge because these mites are very small. And they were finding that rose rosette was moving through neighborhoods so quickly, and that it was actually one of the main reasons they think it was moving so quickly and so widespread was from leaf blowers. And so people would be out blowing their leaves, cleaning up after mowing, and they'd be blowing their roses, and the mites would go to the neighbors' roses, and it would just continue to spread. And Dutch elm disease is another one as well. So, what do we do about all these things that we have that we may potentially encounter within our landscape? So first, talking about diseases, it's important to understand the plant disease triangle. And so this is what we have. We have the host, the pathogen, and the environment. And we need all of these things in order for a disease to be present. And so, but there are a couple kickers to the plant disease triangle. So it's important for us when considering this, we need to have a susceptible host. So if we have a resistant host, a disease may be less likely to occur. Or if we have a plant where the disease isn't even able to feed or grow on that plant, then that host is not susceptible. So we have to have a susceptible host, a host that will get sick by the presence of this disease. We also have to have a virulent pathogen, and so a pathogen that will infect and will feed and will be detrimental to the plant, as well as we need a conducive environment. And so mentioned in the case of fungi, they like it very, very moist. If we have a dry period, we're less likely to have presence of those fungal pathogens. So the environment has to be conducive for the growth of that pathogen in or within a susceptible host. So for example, this is late blight of tomato. It's the same disease that caused the potato famine in Ireland. And so in order for this disease to occur on tomato, we have to have a susceptible plant, so a susceptible tomato variety. We have to have the actual pathogen, so the actual fungal species present, which that's Phytophthora infestans. And we need cool, a wet time period. And so if we have a very cool spring and we're getting a lot of wet weather in May and June, and it stays relatively cold or cool, I should say, then we get the presence of this disease of late blight of tomato. So to control diseases, we need to somehow disrupt this cycle of the plant disease triangle. We need to manipulate it in a way where one of these parts of the plant disease triangle are not present. And so to do that, if you want to think about a three-legged stool cannot stand on two legs. So if you cut one of those legs off, stool falls over and we don't have plant diseases. So a couple ways that we can do this. When it comes to the host, thinking about resistant cultivars. So when you're picking out different varieties, look for some resistance or improved resistance within that particular variety or cultivar. Also important to start with plants that are disease-free. So if something has a disease or isn't doing well in a nursery where it's in a greenhouse and has great temperatures and it's not as exposed to wind and it's getting adequate amount of water and fertilizer, If it's already sick in that situation and we go and we put it out in the natural environment, it's unlikely that it's going to get any better. And I will mention too that just maintaining good plant health and making sure those plants are healthy and have available water and they're not stressed from other things going on, that can really help with our plants as well from getting sick. So plants are in a way like us, where, if we're not eating very healthy and we're not sleeping enough and we're not taking care of ourselves, we tend to get sick more often. And so plants are the same way. And so if you're watering adequately and making sure it has nutrients and is in the right spot and well taken care of, then those plants are more resilient to diseases. And I should say more resilient too to insects, because insects can pick up on that level of stress and tend to go after stress plants more often. And so when it comes to controlling the disease triangle from the perspective of the pathogen, we can use pesticides or fungicides. When it comes to diseases, a lot of time, these pesticides are preventative rather than curative. And so it's going to be essentially spraying them to create a barrier from that disease forming. So if the disease is already there, you may want to approach it more from a strategy of sanitation. And so that can be from pruning, or, maybe in the case of a vegetable garden, if you have a lot of different tomatoes and one comes down with a particular disease, go ahead and pull that one out. That can be a way to sanitize the garden to prevent the spread of those particular pathogens. And then the environment, making sure that you have the right plant in the right place. And that's really to do with making sure that that plant is happy and healthy and resilient to any diseases that are in the surrounding environment. And that too, thinking about environment. So some of those diseases and even some insects really like a humid, protected environment. And so if you have a very thick canopy on your plant, sometimes pruning that out so that airflow can move throughout the plant, that can be a strategy to prevent diseases from forming or getting much worse than they could be. So I'll pause. I'm sorry, I haven't paused for a second. Any questions about what we've covered so far? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to keep going with insect control methods. And so when talking about all of this, consider that IPM. So it's a holistic approach of where we have our foundational efforts, and then depending on the severity, we move up from there. And so mentioned in IPM, integrated pest management, that prevention is really one of the first keys to keeping insects or pests from coming into the garden. And so if we can prevent them from even getting here, that really helps in the long run. And so in the case of pathogens, having those resistant varieties or sanitation, those are all preventative measures. But as well as, especially in the case of insects, is scouting. And so that's going out and actually looking at your plants, because it's a lot easier to control a small population of insects than it is a large population of insects. And so if you can catch it when it's young and very small, your options for control you have a lot more options for control, I should say. And so someone in the pre-assessment mentioned squash bugs, and I knew it was going to come because that's always one of the worst challenges that we have, especially if you're a vegetable gardener. Squash bugs can be pretty not fun. So when talking about squash bugs, scouting is very important. And so knowing what all stages of the life cycle look like, knowing what the eggs look like, what the young nymphal stages of squash bugs look like, that's very important to be able to then go out and remove those when you see them. Because if you see them and it's small and it's just on the underside of a leaf, you can pretty well brush that off. Once they lay their eggs and the nymphal stages take over and we have a large population of the adult squash bugs, it gets very challenging and almost sometimes impossible from a homeowner, backyard garden perspective, if we're not using commercial products. So this is where understanding what the signs and the symptoms look like in the landscape or in the garden as well. So another vegetable garden example, the cabbage worm. So that picture I had up of the very Swiss cheese looking chewing damage, that can be a cabbage worm, where they have chewing mouth parts and really really cause a lot of damage on the leaves. That's another one. If you start to see chewing damage on any of your brassicas, so any of your broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, any of those, if you start to see it, you want to check immediately to see if you can find any of those cabbage worms, because it's very likely that they will take over and that there are also other eggs present. And so all this to say is it's important to go and look at your plants, because typically a widespread infestation isn't going to happen overnight. It may feel like it, but they're there before that infestation becomes overwhelming. And so go out, look at your plants, flip the leaves over, know what the symptoms and signs of certain insects are. That can all be helpful in preventing that. But that also brings me into, especially with insects, is considering the threshold. And so sometimes if there's just a couple maybe bad guys out there, they may not really do a whole lot of damage, or they may get taken out by some of our predatory insects or maybe a bird. And so sometimes if we can tolerate a low number, that can be give us a little bit of peace of mind that not everything has to be perfect, because they may not in a small number do a whole lot of damage. And so we can also too focus our efforts. So if there's maybe an insect, but it's causing a foliage disease on like an oak tree, or I should say foliage symptoms on a large shade tree, that may not be as big of a deal as if we're having foliage chewing damage on a cabbage plant. And so kind of consider those things when talking about or when considering what to do. And of course, you have to decide for yourself. Your gardening style, your gardening motivations are all unique to us. They're all unique to us as individuals. And so how much are you willing to tolerate? Maybe if you really don't want to use if things become out of control, you don't want to use those pesticides, and the other tools in the toolbox aren't going to cause those issues. That may be okay if you don't get tomatoes that year. But then if you're a market gardener and you're depending on the sale of those veggies as your income, that's a different situation. And so all of that's very unique to you and to you as a gardener or a grower, and you have to consider what your preferences are. My computer freezed up. This did this to me last time. Give me just a second. I don't know what happened. Oh, come on. We only had like 4 more slides. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Of course, as I click out of it. Okay, let me start over. All right, where were we? Okay. All right. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? I'm not getting a thumbs up for me. Okay, there we go. I got a thumbs up. Okay. I apologize. Technology, right? Okay. So cultural controls. And so this is really where we can get a lot of effort done in our in our insect and disease control efforts. And so that can include variety selection. So in choosing resistant varieties or varieties that are less susceptible to insects or diseases, doing some that can be really the best first step in our cultural control efforts, as well as sanitation. So I have this picture here of a field, and so in a vegetable garden sense, you really want to clean up that veggie garden in case there are insects or diseases left over. It can be a little harder in the landscape, but if you have a diseased or an insect affected plant, definitely sanitizing that and cleaning that up so that it's not just waiting there for the next season. And then timing your plantings. And so this is a strategy I use with squash bugs. Squash bugs tend to go after very early season planted squash. And so if we get past that first freeze date and you want to go out and plant squash, the squash bugs tend to find those first. But then if you plant it a little bit later, say like almost a fall planting of squash, the squash bugs tend to be less challenging on some of those later plantings of squash. You can also use traps. So in the case, I use the example of squash bugs a lot because there are a lot of examples. But in the case of squash bugs, you can use boards. And so having like a board around your garden, those squash bugs will go underneath. They in the evening, they go and they harbor underneath mulch. But if you have a board there, they'll go there. And then in the morning, you can get up, flip that board over, and as those squash bugs are just waking up in the morning, you can go ahead and squish them and remove them. Beer traps or oil traps. So beer traps can be basically taking like a cat food can or maybe a tuna can and filling that with either beer or oil. Beer can work very well for slugs, whereas oil can be somewhat effective for earwigs. Earwigs can be quite the challenge. Sometimes, especially if we have a very wet spring. Using barriers, and so sometimes insect netting can be an option. Just be aware if you're doing that and it's an insect pollinated plant, because if the bad guys can't get in there, then the good guys can't either. But it can be an option, especially when they're young and they're not flowering yet, just to give them a head start. Or sometimes even using I'll see using like 10 coffee cans around the base of tomatoes. That can help with cutworms when the plants are young. And so just give them a boost to be a little bit older and a little more resilient. And then I have mechanical removal on here as well, but sometimes mechanical controls are grouped in their own. And that's just the wonderful picking them off and squishing them. And so that can be easy when we only have a few pests and they're very easy to see and handle. You can, of course, pick them up and squish them or get rid of them however you see fit. Biological controls can also be a very helpful option. So this is basically where you're using the ecosystem against the pests that you have in your garden or in your landscape. And so we have these beneficial insects that attack other pests. And so we can have predatory insects. And so that'd be like a ladybug or the lacewing that I have photos of here. We can also have parasitoid insects. And so those are insects that will actually lay their eggs in other insects. And it's pretty gnarly, but they will then eat their way out of that insect. So if you ever see the tomato hornworm with all the little white cocoons on it, that's what's going on. And you don't want to get rid of that hornworm because those are all young, more parasitoid. It's a wasp, but more parasitoid wasps that will spread into the environment. So basically, you're using the ecosystem against these bad guys. They are available. You can purchase lacewings and lady beetles, but this can sometimes be unreliable for homeowners, or especially really unreliable if you're not growing in a controlled environment. So this can be a great option if you're in a greenhouse. That's an enclosed environment. But if you release all these fantastic predatory insects in an outdoor environment, There's no guarantee that they're going to hang out in your garden, and they may not just go over to your neighbors. So just keep that in mind and tailor your expectations. And then there are also, you may find fungal or bacterial pathogens formulated as insecticides. So an example of this would be BT, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, but you're probably going to see it labeled as BT, which is actually a bacteria that then gets the some insects sick. So different formulations or different particular species of BT can be formulated for caterpillars. Some can be formulated for fly type pests like mosquitoes. So those are all available as well. And then the last tool in our toolbox, we have chemical controls. So I say this is just the last resort because we want to do our due diligence and try all this before we just necessarily maybe go out there with a fix-all, cure-all. We want to create a garden and a landscape that's suited for resilience so that we don't have to constantly be out there managing it with some kind of chemical control. Now that's to say we do have there are organic chemical pesticides. And so even organic pesticides are still pesticide. A pesticide is just something that's designed to kill. But organic ones are ones that are derived from natural sources, whereas synthetic are man-made. But the absolute thing, if you go home with anything tonight, is to make sure that you read your pesticide label. So if you're using any of these products, make sure that you are reading that label thoroughly and making sure that you are applying that product correctly, because that's the instructions on how to use that product properly and in a way that's safe for you and for the environment. And that pesticide label is considered the law. And so if you don't follow it, it is considered that you're breaking the law. And so you want to look at it for things like what temperatures to spray. Can it be sprayed to edible crops? Can it be sprayed to flowering crops? All those things will be on the pesticide label. And so make sure that you're reading those and understanding them. We can also have contact or systemic insecticides. And so contact are pesticides where it actually has to come in contact with the pest itself, whereas systemic are absorbed by the plant. And then if that pest or insect feeds on the plant, then it ingests that insecticide or pesticide and endures the detrimental effects. And so afterwards, after you use that product, make sure you monitor the pest, because unfortunately, sometimes if you continually spray and spray and spray with the same product, a resistance can actually build up within that population. And so it's also a good idea, if you're in a situation where you need to be spraying so much, is to alternate your modes of action. And so that's essentially the way in which that pesticide kills that insect. And so whatever metabolic function within that organism that's disrupted, or I should say there are different ways in which that metabolic function is disrupted, and that can be represented by the modes of action on a pesticide label. So if you are doing something where you're rotating sprays, make sure to alternate modes of action so that you don't build up a resistance. That can happen if you're just using one mode of action over and over and over again. So those are a couple notes on chemical controls. So to wrap up this evening, pest control for both insects and diseases, it's a multi-step approach to understanding how we can control and mitigate that pest. And it starts with prevention. And so if we can prevent those insects or diseases from getting into the garden in the first place, that can be a very helpful first step. When controlling diseases, we want to manipulate that disease triangle, knock that three-legged stool over. Insects can be controlled through a variety of different ways, but there are so many more approaches than just the spray and pray, spray on the calendar method. And so make sure you're using a holistic, integrated pest management approach to your pest control. And I have to leave you with this, that not all insects are bad. So when you're looking in your garden, make sure that you are able to identify that insect. If you need help with that, email me. I'm happy to help you with that, because sometimes we may be dealing with a not so good guy, but maybe it's a good guy too that we want to keep in our garden and promote, because it's there doing some of the pest control work for us. So keep in mind, not all insects are bad. So to wrap up, resources, I hope you're aware of our fact sheet website. Go check it out. You can search a variety of topics. We have quite a few on diseases and insects. So if there is a particular pest that you're interested in, you can go and find more information about that. And with that, I think we went a little bit over, but I'll take some questions that you have. I know anything on spotted cucumber beetles. Oof. Spotted cucumber beetles are going to be too hard-bodied for products like diatomaceous earth, which is an organic product. I think there are some maybe spinosad based, which would be organic. But I'd have to do a little bit of digging on specific controls on spotted cucumber beetles. If you shoot me an email, I'll do a little bit of a deep dive for you and get you some more tailored information. I know someone in the pre-assessment asked about ants, which can be very tricky. If you're looking for, there are a couple of spinosad type organic pesticides for ants, but boric acid can also be an organic option for ants, as well as there are quite a few different synthetic options for ants as well. But I know that may not be something you want to use in a vegetable setting and an edible setting. And so if you want to go with an organic, I believe boric acid, and there are some spinosad based products. All right. Thank you, Janet, for your kind words. Not seeing any other questions, I will go ahead and log off. But if you have joined us for this 6 weeks, I want to thank you so much. This is the first time we've done it online as a webinar, and I think it's been a lot of fun. I will send out recording and post assessment tomorrow, so please take a look at that. And then if you have any suggestions for future webinar type programs, I'd love to hear it. I'm considering maybe doing something eco gardening friendly focused in April. So stay tuned, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.